In the small town of Turner's Field, hidden in the dense forests, the locals were afraid of one house. It was called the house behind the door. No one knew what happened there, but it was rumored that anyone who crossed its threshold never returned. One day, a young man named Alex, who had just arrived in town, decided to rent this house for living. He did not believe in superstitions and considered it all a fiction. But something was wrong with this place. On the very first night, he heard strange sounds behind the basement door. It was not just a noise. It was a whisper that called him. Alex gathered his courage and opened the basement door. It was dark below, and the air smelled strongly of dampness and something else, like old blood. Someone was scratching the words on the walls. "Don't come in. This shadow lives here." The lower Alex went, the more he felt someone's gaze on him. His flashlight suddenly went out, and the room was filled with pitch darkness. Then he heard a voice that did not belong to a human. "You came for me. Then you will stay." Alex ran, but the door closed behind him. With each night, he began to notice how the shadow got closer, first in the mirror, then in the corners of the room. Every night it became more real until it entered his body. Now Alex does not live in Turner's Field, but everyone who meets him notices something strange. His shadow moves completely differently from him. Hear their cry. On the outskirts of the town of Ridgehaven stood an old radio tower, long abandoned after an accident. It was said that it once picked up signals from all over the world, even from places that didn't exist on any map. However, after one night shift completely disappeared. The tower was closed and its equipment was left to rust. Jason, a young radio amateur, had heard legends that strange signals could be picked up on the frequency 1366 if he was close enough to the old tower. One evening he decided to check it out. Turning on his radio, he tuned to the indicated frequency. For the first few minutes there was only a hiss, but then, amidst the crackle, a soft whisper appeared. "Can you hear us? We're here. We're still waiting." The voice sounded supernatural. It sounded like the cries of children, interspersed with loud, intermittent breathing. Jason decided to go to the tower to better understand what was happening. When he got there, his receiver began to tune itself, and the frequencies changed chaotically. Finally, he heard a shout, "Don't come any closer. They won't let go." Jason ignored the warning and climbed up the tower. Inside its cabin, he saw an old console with dusty buttons that still glowed red. Suddenly, all the screens turned on, showing the faces of people screaming silently. "Help us," they begged, their eyes black cavities. The tower came to life, and Jason began to hear voices right in his head. They called his name, showed fragments of his childhood, made him remember the most terrible moments. He realized that these were the ones who had disappeared during the last broadcast many years ago. Jason felt something invisible pulling him towards the console, forcing him to press a large button that pulsed blue. Jason could not resist. His hand, as if guided by an invisible force, reached for the blue button. When he pressed it, the cabin was filled with a piercing sound that made his ears ring. It seemed that the sound penetrated every cell of his body, paralyzing his will. Images began to appear on the screens in front of him. The city in which he lived was covered with a dark wave, as if disappearing under a shadow. The voices that had previously pleaded for help now turned into mocking laughter. "You opened the doors, Jason. Now they are all ours." Black liquid began to ooze from the walls of the cabin. A thick and oily fog enveloped his legs. Jason tried to escape, but the cabin door closed with a deafening thud. He saw the shadows flowing from the walls take shape, figures with empty eyes and outstretched arms reaching for him. They whispered something incomprehensible, but each word left Jason feeling as if he was losing a part of himself. "Do you want to get out, Jason? Stay with us, or give us someone to take your place?" For a moment, he saw himself in the reflected screen, but it wasn't him. His eyes had become as empty as the shadows, and a strange smile had frozen on his face. He remembered the words he had heard before entering the tower. "They won't let go. But suddenly, amidst the chaos, he heard a familiar voice, quiet and calm. It was his younger sister, Emma, who had always told him to believe in himself. "You're strong, Jason. You can close them." Gritting his teeth, he broke free from the shadow's control and reached for the remote control again. His hand trembled, but he found the red button marked isolation. He knew this was his last chance. Feeling the shadows trying to hold him back, Jason pressed the button. There was a blast of light that blinded everything around him. Screams filled the cabin, and the shadows began to dissolve in the light. When he came to, the tower was silent. The radio in his hands had burned away, leaving only a scar on his palm. But the story did not end there. Jason knew that somewhere, in the deepest corners of the ether, the shadows were still waiting for their chance to return. Jason tried to forget that night, but the memories of the tower haunted him. He began to notice strange things. The noise on the radio even when it was off. Shadows that moved when no one was around, and whispers that sounded right inside his head. One night, after waking from a nightmare, Jason heard the sound of his old radio in the living room. He was sure he had destroyed it after the events in the tower, but now it was sitting on the table, working. There was only a crackle on the frequency 1366, but suddenly a familiar voice whispered, "You shut us down, but you didn't stop us. We will always be there." Jason rushed to the receiver to turn it off, but as soon as he touched it, his body went numb. The radio screen lit up red, and figures began to emerge from it. Familiar shadows with empty eyes. "You gave us light, Jason, and now we are free." The shadows scattered around the room, then began to disappear into the darkness. Jason realized that they had escaped into the real world and would now hunt the others. He tried to find answers, rereading old newspapers and archives. All traces led to the first incident in the tower. Then the night shift disappeared, and the only entry found on the console was this: "Light opens doors, but only shadow knows how to close them." Jason realized that to stop the shadows, he needed to return to the tower. But this time he would not go alone. He turned to his old friend Lauren, who worked as an electrical engineer and was a skeptic, not believing in any legends. "If you're going to go, we better have a plan," she said, packing up the old equipment. Together they returned to the tower, now surrounded by dead silence. Lauren turned on the scanners and began to analyze the frequencies. She discovered something strange. The shadows were using the ether as a communication channel, penetrating people's minds through weak signals. "They're like parasites," she said. "If we find their base frequency, we can create a counter-signal to neutralize them." But at that moment, the cabin came to life. The radio panel glowed red, and the door behind them closed. The shadows appeared again, this time more powerful than before. "You can't win, Jason. We are a part of you." Lauren, without hesitation, began to enter commands on the remote, adjusting the frequency to counteract. Her hands were shaking, but she continued. Jason, meanwhile, tried to keep the shadows away by using a flashlight, the light of which dissolved them for a second. Suddenly, all the screens were filled with faces again, pleading, "Close us. But don't let the light go out." Lauren finished the setup and activated the counter-alarm. There was a loud crack, and the tower shook as if its foundation had been blown apart. Light filled the cockpit, destroying the shadows. When it was all over, the cockpit was empty, and the tower now looked dead. Jason and Lauren decided never to return here again. But even after that, Jason still felt that the shadows were not gone for good. They were simply waiting for a new opportunity. Shadows living in the light. A few weeks had passed since Jason and Lauren left the tower. It seemed that the horror was behind them, but the shadows weren't gone, they were just waiting. One morning, when Jason woke up, he noticed something strange. The sun outside the window was brighter than usual, but its light had a strange, cold tint. When he went to the bathroom mirror, he saw that his reflection was moving with a delay, and the shadow behind it seemed thicker and denser than it should be. Lauren, who had been working on new projects since the tower, had also noticed strange things. Her electronics began to malfunction. The lights in the lab flickered for no reason. And one day she saw her own shadow reflected on the wall even when the lights were off. The shadows found a way to survive. Now they were hiding in the light, using it as a portal to move into this world. Jason received an anonymous package with a strange letter and an old photograph. The photo was of a night shift of the tower that had disappeared many years ago. But what shocked him most was that among the figures in the photo, he recognized himself. The letter consisted of a single sentence. "You were there then, you are here now, and you will be there when we return." He did not understand what this meant until he remembered the moment in the tower, when the screens showed his reflection with empty eyes. Lauren, examining the remnants of the counter signal, noticed that the frequency that had cleansed the tower was now active again. But this time the signal was coming from everywhere. From cell towers, televisions, even simple light bulbs. "They are using every source of light," she said. "It's not just about the radio anymore. They are becoming part of the world." Jason knew what he had to do. They returned to the tower, trying to find a way to interrupt this process. But the tower was different now. Its cabin had become a huge tangle of shadows that moved as if they were alive. "You're back," a voice came from everywhere. "And you will help us complete the transition." Jason and Lauren realized that their arrival was expected. The shadows needed them to complete the connection between their world and reality. But Lauren was ready. She had developed a device that could not only generate a counter signal, but also create obstacles in the light itself, forcing the shadows to lose their shape. While Lauren adjusted the device, Jason distracted the shadows. They became more aggressive, pulling his legs, grabbing his arms, but he fought back. As the device activated, the tower shuddered. A powerful pulse of light shot through the walls, and the shadows began to disperse, letting out terrible screams. But amidst the chaos, Jason noticed something strange. One shadow remained. It stood before him, silent, and it seemed to be his own. It said, "You can't run away, Jason. You're one of us." The lights went out. Lauren recovered, but Jason was gone. Only an old receiver tuned to 1366 remained in the cabin, crackling softly. The shadows were gone, but in every mirror, every reflective surface, something was now always watching. Shadows that don't go away. A few months have passed since Jason's disappearance. Lauren has returned to her normal life, but she's haunted by the feeling that the shadows are still there. Every night, when she falls asleep, she dreams of the tower and its voice, pleading for help. One day, Lauren receives a strange package without a return address. Inside was an old cassette recorder and a note. "He's still here. If you want to know the truth, turn it on." Her hands trembled as she inserted the cassette. At first, there was only static, but then Jason's voice came out. "Lauren, they're using me, but I found the key. You need to return to the tower, but this time, be prepared for the truth." After that, the recording ended, but the tape recorder suddenly turned on by itself. Instead of Jason's voice, it whispered, "You've only seen the surface, but you have no idea what lies deeper. Come to us, or he will be ours forever." Lauren had no choice now. She returned to the tower, armed with a new technology, a powerful jammer that could isolate any signal. But when she turned on the device, something unexpected happened. Instead of scattering the shadows, they began to condense into one huge figure. The shadowy figure spoke in Jason's voice, but at the same time it seemed that something much more was hidden behind it. "You thought you could stop us, but we are no longer shadows. We are light now, and you yourself gave us power." Lauren realized the terrible truth. Every step she took to fight the shadows only strengthened them. They adapted, becoming stronger, and now they no longer needed the tower. They had penetrated all sources of light, slowly covering the entire world. At the last moment, when the shadowy figure almost swallowed her, Lauren noticed a glint in the corner of the cabin, an old radio receiver. Inspiration seized her. She changed the frequency of the generator, tuning it to the same frequency of 1366. A wave of powerful sound rang out, forcing the shadow to stop. It fell apart, leaving behind only emptiness. But when Lauren looked around the cabin, she saw the last inscription, which seemed to be carved directly into the air. "You gave us freedom. We will return." Now Lauren knew that this was not a victory, but only a temporary pause. The shadows had become part of the world, and next time their attack would be more sophisticated and dangerous. And in that moment she understood. Jason was not gone forever. He became the key that the shadows could use to return. Shadows that became light. Lauren left the tower, but now she knew that the struggle was far from over. Every day she watched the world around her change. The lights flickered for no apparent reason. The TV screens flickered even when they were off, and her own shadow seemed to become thicker and more alive. Her research led her to ancient archives. They mentioned something similar. Events in another small town almost a century ago. There, too, shadows appeared that penetrated the light. People disappeared, leaving only mysterious inscriptions on the walls. Light is their home. The old documents mentioned a device called a spectral stabilizer. It was an experimental invention designed to study frequencies that interacted with space and time, but the device was destroyed after a series of terrible incidents. Lauren realized it could be the key to understanding shadows. She began searching for the location of its remains. Her search led her to an abandoned research facility in the mountains. The facility was abandoned, but inside it remained traces of its former activities, outdated computers, burned blueprints, and the remains of the device itself. Amidst the chaos, Lauren found an old diary belonging to one of the scientists. It described a theory that explained the nature of the shadows. They were not just beings. They were resonances from another dimension, seeking a way to establish themselves in our reality through light waves. The diary also contained a final entry. If they cross over completely, they will change the very fabric of our world. Light will become their guide, and shadows will trap us. Lauren decided to restore the device, hoping that she could close the gap between the worlds. It took several weeks, but she was finally able to activate it. As soon as the device started working, the air around it vibrated, and the light in the room became abnormally bright. Suddenly, familiar figures appeared in the light. Shadows. They were no longer hiding, but stood before her, silent but threatening. And among them there was one who was different from the others. "Lauren." Jason's voice sounded, but it was distorted, as if mixed with the whispers of thousands of others. "Jason, is that you?" She whispered, not believing her eyes. "We are one now. You cannot destroy us, but you can join." The shadows began to come closer. Lauren realized that the device was not closing the breach. On the contrary, it was opening it even wider. She tried to turn it off, but the shadows had already merged with the light, absorbing everything around. The world became blindingly bright, and it seemed that the border between light and darkness had completely disappeared. Suddenly, a vision came over her. Shadows were appearing all over the world, emanating from every source of light. People were hiding in the darkness, which was now their only safety. And then everything went quiet. Lauren opened her eyes and found herself standing in the middle of an empty room. The device had been destroyed, but she was no longer alone. Her own shadow had gone out of control, now moving independently of her. The shadow turned to her and said, "We gave you a chance. Now you are ours." The light went out, and Lauren was gone. That's right. An open ending not only keeps the plot interesting, but also allows for new plot development or the introduction of new characters who could fight this threat. You can imagine how, after Lauren's disappearance, a group of researchers, journalists, or even ordinary people appear who have noticed strange changes in their cities. Their task is to uncover what happened and find a way to confront the shadows. Or the story could go global, where the shadows have already taken over a significant part of the world, and humanity is now forced to live in darkness, fighting for survival. It could be a mix of horror, post-apocalyptic, and science fiction genres.